Hi there all, welcome. Good afternoon. Welcome to the 266th Sydney Mining Club Forum, albeit it's not face-to-face. It's online, which isn't ideal, but that's where we're up to at the moment with COVID. We did have an exciting speaker lined up for our Sydney event, but sadly we've had to postpone that. But we have a very exciting speaker today, Norm Sawyer, who Julian will introduce shortly. Welcoming you all and looking forward to hearing from Norm. Julian, over to you.
Great. Am I on now, Georgina? Thank you. Hi and welcome everybody. And we love to be together, and we were going to be together every time from December onwards when we went live again, and here we find ourselves trapped once more by the Omicron. The wave is coming through here in Sydney. I think the infection rate is plummeting. So we hopefully will be back live next month. Fingers crossed. We'll just have to see how that plays out. Australia is a great uranium producing nation. We all know that. And for many years, we've had this strange sort of mysterious policy of a four-mine policy, which I reckon isn't a policy. So how can you have a policy that says it's moral to mine uranium, but so long as you only have 4 mines? The other great ridiculous point about it is that there's no moral standing for a policy that says that it's okay to mine uranium, not to react it. Opinion is changing across Australia. Now, two out of every 3 Australians support nuclear energy. We're at a tipping point. We've had the announcement about the US nuclear-powered submarines coming to our defence force. So we're at a tipping point. And for that reason, through some things that I've been doing recently, I've come to know Norm Sawyer, who's a great Canadian, done some terrific things. And as I stand here with blue sky behind me, Norm has just weathered down his 3rd snowstorm in New Brunswick. He's got snow up to the eaves nearly, and so it's he's not wearing a woolly jacket, but outside he would be. Listen, I won't take it too much further, Norm. We would love to hear more about small modular reactors and for you to take the floor. Thank you so much for making the effort to be with us all the way from Canada. And we'll have some questions. We'll have chats on the way through. They come up for me, so I'll be able to see any questions that emerge. You can raise your hand, but the Q&A is definitely the best. The bottom right hand, the Q&A is definitely the best thing if you want to raise a question. And if I see it suitable, I might even interject, Norm, and throw your question en route, but otherwise we'll take them at the other end. Ladies and gentlemen, may I welcome Norm Sawyer.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here. Obviously, I would have loved to fly to Australia and see that blue sky behind you, Julian, but in the world we're in today, it's a little bit more difficult. And I think Canada is also, we've kind of hit the peak, and hopefully we're on our way down again. I'm just going to share my screen here and have a conversation really about the things we've done in Canada, the things I've done, and that that got us to nuclear. And as Julian was speaking, it was interesting to me. Most of our uranium comes out of the province of Saskatchewan, and interestingly, it's very comparable to Australia in the sense that they don't have any nuclear either. They just ship it out. They just ship the uranium. The Cameco is one of the largest uranium companies, much like the big ones in Australia. So therefore, it's a little bit careful, but comparable. And but I believe that and I'll talk about this a little bit later, in our discussions moving forward, Saskatchewan has now become a player and possibly moving into having a nuclear SMR in their region also. So I'll just go to the share screen here, and hopefully everybody can see this. So let's just talk about SMRs, small modular reactors. as a source of clean energy. And really, there's kind of I branded them 3 levels. There's the large type that everybody knows. That's the large reactors. There's also the small modular reactors, but there's also the micro reactors, that 3rd level down, which is made for, and what Canada's been looking for, to put it up north and to use for mines. And I'll talk a little bit about this later, about the mining piece of it in the analysis that was done. Okay, let's go over here. Can everybody see this? Yeah. There we go. The first thing, I just want to manage some expectations here. The discussion will be technical neutral. I don't go for one or the other, although I do have a history of one particular vendor. We're kind of going to keep a limited technical overview, and we're going to try to balance optimistic views of realism. And you'll see that I'll bring up some of the reports that have come out from an investor side, what they've been looking at. And I always premise this with the fact that one watershed event, one significant event in nuclear can always impact everything. The nuclear industry is going through somewhat of a renaissance currently, and obviously with time, more and more you'll gain more and more momentum. But it really depends a lot to ensure there's no other events that occur. So these are my subjective views. Obviously, other experts may have a different sense of opinion, but I think I normally do a pretty good job balancing. From my perspective, personally, I've been around this for a long time in Canada and internationally. I've been, I started my career with a company called MB Power, where I got licensed to run the reactors. And from there, I moved on to the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, which is the regulator. I spent a decade there. I then came back and then went to the province of Quebec and ran their nuclear program. And then moved on to Bruce Power. Now, Bruce Power owns the largest, or one of the largest operating sites in the world. It's 6,000 megawatts, 8 reactors. When I was there was like 12,000 people working there. It's just quite a size. And then I went into my consulting firm. I did some work for Arc Clean Energy. In the midst of all that, I also did some work with the World Association of Nuclear Operators, and spent a lot of time. And just in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a picture there with myself and the premiers of 3 provinces. On the left of me, on the first one on the left is Premier Higgs. He's the New Brunswick, the province which I'm in. Then there's the third one from the left is Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario. And then there's Premier Moe, which is the Premier of Saskatchewan. And that's Saskatchewan, as I mentioned, was where a lot of the uranium comes from in Canada. So those 3 gentlemen agreed that working together, the SMR goal of bringing SMRs to Canada, there was an MOU between the 3 provinces that really was the culmination of all the work the industry did and companies, the supply chain that worked together to make a strong point about nuclear continuing in Canada. I do have some history with Australia a little bit. Obviously met Julian last summer, and of course Sydney Mining Club today. But also I was very, very happy to meet Andrew Wood, who's the previous CEO of Worley. He came to New Brunswick for a couple of reasons, not necessarily just to see me, but at the time I was CEO of the company. So we spent some time together. There was a gentleman, Mr. Grant King. My understanding, he was the previous president of the Business Council of Australia. He flew in about the same time that I had a couple of interviews with Aaron Patrick from the Australia Financial Post, who were asking questions about SMR. And there was a lot of debate going on in Australia, and they were looking for some input to what these things are and how they operate. And there was the other 2 companies. Rolls-Royce was involved, and so was Terrestrial Energy. So I've had some history with Australia. Never been there. I'd love to go someday, but it's really interesting. The debate at the time. I haven't heard much lately on the debate about nuclear in Australia, but I know there's a lot of people, as Julian was mentioning, that are looking at that possibility. So let's just have a high-level outlook for the nuclear industry to start off with. And really, if you look around the world for nuclear, You know, up on the top left there's a map of the world, and you see the 30 most reliant countries on nuclear energy. And of course, France being the head keeper there at 76% of their electricity, although there's no more plants in the US. The French fleet actually has a bigger percentage of the grid. So there's about, you know, nuclear is about 10% of the world electricity market. You know, it's 445 nuclear power plants. It's the second largest source of low carbon energy behind hydro. But there's also about 220 reactors, or research reactors, I'll call them, in over 50 countries. And then there is one in Australia. There's the, it's called OPAL, Open Pool Australian Light Water Reactor. I'm sure you all know. It's a research reactor. It does radioisotopes and testing, research and development using neutron beams on metals and things like that. And it's there for various reasons. Now, to run all that, you need uranium. And this is where countries such as Canada and Australia play a big role. And there's only about 10, I guess my understanding is only about 10 companies, mining companies, that account for about 85% of all uranium used. So, you know, there's a link to nuclear from Australia. And as Julian mentioned, I think with things developing now, there might be a time, this may be a good time frame for the country to start looking at that. And I think that it needs to be more than politicians. You know, I always say that I talk from from our country. There's really no votes in nuclear. There's votes in jobs, and I'm not sure how Australian politicians work, but if you spend a lot of time showing the benefit of an industry, certainly if it can replace other things, then I think politicians come to learn about you know, the real reasoning to have an industry in the country. You know, the SMR market was really sold in Canada, was really sold around, of course, technologies is one thing, but was really sold around the jobs that come with them. And they're good paying jobs. And they're long, you know, have long careers. Especially, it can involve a lot of youths and engineers, you know, coming out of universities, things like that. If you look at the worldwide electric market, about 36% of it is low carbon and electricity. And you know, as I said, nuclear is about 10% of that. Renewables is 26%. But really, of all the energy used in the world, you know, for various industrial processes and things like that. Really, the electricity part, the power sector is only about 25%. So there's a whole 75% of the market in industry, heavy industries, mining, for example, things that hydrogen production that nuclear is not involved with today. So really, there's a large market there that, you know, nuclear has always been only used for electricity. And possibly one of the reasons why, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, is about the coolant that's used in the large reactor, which is water. So you're limited to certain levels of temperature or steam pressures. So if you look at the world today, most countries are really looking to move to a higher percentage of low carbon electricity. If you look at the square now, and it's hard to tell, but there's our 10 provinces and territories, and you'll see the black line that peaks up and down. Well, the black line is the emissions line. So, for example, if the second one from the left is AB, which is the province of Alberta, you'll notice a lot of coal being burnt there, which is spiking the emissions. Where if you go to ON, which is Ontario, you see the green, they're mostly nuclear, and you can see how much lower the line is. So wherever there's a peak, except for Ontario, which is gas, but it's coal driven. So there's 4 provinces that has coal generation for which by 2030, they have to be offline. I think it works out to about 16 or 17 plant units. So right now today, the electricity in Canada is about 83% emission free. And what they're saying is with electrification that's coming along with electrical vehicles and whatever else, there's a need about twice as much non-emitting electricity than there is today, and in less than 3 decades. So a lot of things have to change very quickly. And if you look at Alberta again, which is the highest, one of the things that Alberta is being criticized is on the oil side because of the emissions coming from the oil sands. Well, if they use Alberta electricity to do that, it adds about 8% more emissions to every barrel because the electricity is being driven by coal. So therefore, there's a real push going on in all the provinces to work towards something that we can generate the same amount of energy, but with lower emissions. So if we look internationally now, the IEA has this net zero roadmap, they call it, and they've gone and looked at every country for announced pledge cases, they call them. So every government made pledges. This may be a little difficult to see, but the one on the left, the square on the left, kind of shows you where you want to be in 2020, 2030, and 2050. And in that model, what's really coming out today is that renewables will go from about 30% of electricity to 70%. And so therefore, the red squares is the nuclear. You can see it's still there, but it changes not as much as one would think, because the more renewables, and we'll talk about this in a second here, the more renewables you have, the less reliable is the grid. So if you move over to the right-hand side now, where it's really the key milestones to the pathway, and if you look at 2050, the big question is, will nuclear fit in this model, where 90% of heavy industry production will be low emissions, and 70% of electricity will be from solar and wind. So how does nuclear fit in that model is fundamentally the question that's going around the world today. It's quite a debate, actually. So if you look at some of the studies that have come out on the investor side, there's Evaluate Reports is one of the companies that produces things, and they see SMR market being part of that. They see a growth from somewhere in the 3 billion mark in 2020, and they see the growth being almost 16% to 18 billion by 2030. And really, Asia Pacific is the area where the growth will be the greatest. And it's all around electricity. So they do think there will be some desalination also. And, I think places like Saudi Arabia and that I've been thinking about how to do that, use this sort of heat to generate. But there's also other market research assessment. Adasian is another one. It really divided the market up and saying, they agree that electrical is probably the biggest market, but there is going to be some heat requirements for hydrogen and steam methane reforming. Even in the Financial Post here, just before Christmas, I noted a quote from a gentleman, Mr. Beveridge, and he said, while nuclear has many problems, and they talked about safety and cost, but the one big advantage it has is base load clean energy supply, which is hard to replicate. You just can't replicate what a nuclear power plant can do unless you have a lot of hydro. Another group that looks at this very carefully is called Third Way Energy for Growth Hub. And they look at this by saying they gauge the country's relative preparedness and motivation for civilian nuclear development. And you can see on the left-hand side, the top left, all the green circles around the world. The dark greens are, they're ready. They believe that country is ready by 2030. And the light greens is, they're a little bit later. They're it's not as strong. And then if you look down to the right, I looked at North America, which was interesting to me, is that they see the US obviously being ready by 2030, but there's one single small little dot, and I had to put an arrow to show where it was. That is the oil sands. And so there's obviously some thought that the oil sands will at one point use nuclear energy or clean energy to extract the oil out of the ground. Because right now they're using about 25% of all the natural gas in Canada ends up going in the oil fields to get that oil out of the ground. So really, the point I'm trying to make here is the market for SMR is developing and it's growing. The other thing that plays into this is the financing of SMR technology, and this is where there's really polarized views whether nuclear is green or not, and that conversation continues. And there was a report in the Conference Board of Canada that talked a lot about this and talked about how nuclear energy has become a sin industry alongside gambling and tobacco. So, I mean, that's the comparison people are making sometimes. But really, this is really at odds what nuclear energy can do in generating zero emission electricity and addressing climate change. So that whole conversation, discussion about whether nuclear can really play a role because of its, the concerns with safety and waste. But the new reactors have looked at that. And in fact, the new reactors are safer. I mean, the old reactors were safe, but these things are safer. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Safer than the current generation or the past generations. And some of them can actually take care of the waste, which is which is one piece that the industry has always been looking for. And really, there's a whole conversation occurring at the European Union taxonomy discussions, and it's really, this taxonomy is really defines Europe's approach to financial products, and it does introduce a risk factor if that technology is not there. So the debate today, and it was today, yesterday, since Christmas, about whether natural gas and nuclear will be included in this, because all the experts say we can't get to where we want to go unless nuclear plays a role. And this is where, SMRs will be a part of that. It's not the whole thing. There'll still be big reactors constructed, but the SMRs do play a role in that. So let's just talk about SMRs here for a few minutes and what's available and how things are going. So really SMRs, what they really look at from a technology perspective is really decarbonizing the energy systems, repowering fossil fuel sites. In Europe, a lot of district heating, it can be done. It also accesses new sectors and regions. And I talked a little bit about that 75%. It can play in that, and it can also go off grid in the most remote regions and to support electricity for various regions that don't have it today. And obviously, it can support the variable renewable energy. There's wind and solar. I always said is required. I think people like it. Sometimes they don't like it in the backyard. But at the end of the day, it's not there all the time. Now, Australia is very lucky. They probably run higher solar than most, but it's still 40, 50% capacity factor, which is, where are you going to get the rest of the energy? So in Canada here, we're not going to be doing very well with solar because it snows so much, it covers the panels. But from Canada's perspective, again, and much like for any other country, it works in the oil sands. SMRs can work for heavy industry, remote communities, and taking place of the conventional coal-fired stations. And that coal site repowering is really is happening in a lot of areas around the world. And basically, the fundamental principle of it is that you replace coal boilers with an SMR heat source, and what you do is you use as much of the existing infrastructure as possible. So therefore you reduce the construction cost. So if you can cut out, $300, $400, $500, $600, $700 million out of a build, and the SMRs obviously, they run in around the $2 to $3 billion mark. Some are around $1 billion. It's significant because you can use the turbines, the grid connections, the cooling, but the extent of that use of that site is really technology dependent. And I'll talk about that in a second also. And what it also does, remember I talked earlier about, getting votes and making sure people are taken care of. there's the concept of just transition. So let's say there's a site that has, coal site that uses 200-300, people working around there. Well, if you build the SMRs, you can transfer. Their skills and abilities are very transferable in most cases. And in the rest of the cases, it's just a matter of retraining or upgrading. And you have most of your staff all ready to go to work in the SMR, in the nuke facility. So therefore, the area, the community doesn't suffer quite as much, which is really important in some of the discussions we've had here in Canada and around the world. In fact, in Wyoming, there's an SMR going in there. Mr. Bill Gates has a project underway, and that's the concept they're going to use. And I believe in the last couple of days, Wyoming was a state that would not entertain new builds, but yet the legislature just voted here in the last couple of days to allow it, as they recognize Wyoming has a lot of coal. So they recognize that with time, they're going to become stranded assets, it seems like, if we continue down the road we're at. So therefore, the state has changed their policy to allow this significant transition to occur. So a little bit on SMRs. There's about 70 different designs of these things, if you look at the IEA. And they're kind of broken into Gen 3 plus, right? So the current generation of SMRs are called Generation 3. Well, the SMR, of nuclear technology, the SMRs that are coming on they're being called Generation 3 plus, and they're still water cooled. So in a way, they're big reactors made small. That's basically the philosophy behind it. Of course, they're a lot safer. And then you have the Gen 4s, which are really the new reactors coming to market. They've been around for some time. A lot of them have already designs that have operated, in labs and whatever else. So, and they're kind of divided into liquid metal cool fast reactors. There's the gas cool. So the liquid metal cool are sodium and lead. That's coolant. They operate at high temperature but low pressure. Essentially atmospheric pressure. Gas cool reactors, they operate at high temperatures and higher than liquid metal, but they are pressurized. And where molten salt reactors, again, they are high temperatures and again, low pressure, but they have different sorts of fuel. So one particular model has a fuel assembly like you would see in today's reactor. And then there's another particular model that has the fuel actually mixed in the coolant in the molten salt. And in nuclear, the capital cost is really a direct function of the reactor safety case. So the safer you make it, with inherent safety, with smaller reactor cores, with simpler systems, with built-in safety systems, you really means that the safety range can be proportionate with a reduced risk profile. Reduce the risk, you reduce the cost. The regulator is much more comfortable with licensing these things. So therefore, it kind of all works its way back. And that's why step one of reduced costs for the SMRs is really around the size, the smaller size of it. Which means shorter delivery times and, really reduce upfront investment. So, the shorter the construction time means the investment doesn't have to wait as long to get their money back. The second piece of that is being modular. You really have a lot more control on quality and on schedule. And really, the industry, the nuclear industry, the SMR market, is really learning a lot from the shipbuilding industry. They've really done a lot of good work in understanding how you learn for each model you build. So, and again, the degree, the more modularization you have, you have a bigger impact on capital costs. And some are more modularized than others. So therefore, it's really important to understand the degree of modularization for a particular SMR. And of course, the reactor, reduced size brings, the ability to have more integrated designs and inherent safety capabilities and lower core inventory. So it means there's less, let's call it less power. The thermal efficiency is really, as probably most of you know, is temperature dependent. So a large nuclear reactor, it's in the range of 30%, thermal efficiency, where coal units 45 and a gas plate's around 50. But what's driving that is the temperature. So a large nuclear reactor is water cooled, remember what I said. So it's about 300 degrees on the outlet, 325, 350. So, it's at the lower scale of temperature. Where you get some of these SMRs, the water-cooled ones, they're still in the same range, 300. But these metal and salt and gas SMRs, the Gen 4s that we talked about, they're in the range of 500 to 900 degrees C. So their efficiency really, really goes up. And can produce some pretty high temperature steam. So what you have here then, so let's go back and have a look at, size and temperature plays a role in this market. And you can see here the various industrial applications of, district heating, and then you go up halfway, there's plastic manufacturing, and you keep going up the list. The yellow bars at the top are the different types of SMRs. And I pointed out LWR, which is the Gen 3 Plus. You can see it's at the lower range of that bottom scale. Is the temperature, by the way. It's at the lower range of that. So water-based technologies would only be able to handle a little bit on that bottom side. But again, to get at 75% of the non-power sector energy usage, you have to be on the right side of a red dotted line. And that's where the Gen 4s come into play. And you can use them a lot. And for example, hydrogen is one of the things that you could do. Ammonia. There's a number of areas where these high temperature reactors can really help out. So again, talking about temperature, I talked a little bit about repurposing a coal site. A coal site needs high temperature because the turbines and all the equipment that's in there now runs with coal, and so therefore you need steam temperatures, at the higher end. Water coolant will not do that, so you use a lesser part of that site infrastructure. So you can actually get some of these SMRs is a 1-for-1, so you can actually use everything. Just as a salient point here, I call it fit for purpose. Some of the work that I've done is helping companies understand the things they need to think about when they're selecting a type of technology.
No, these just
and really, as I mentioned, technology does play an important role, but there's a lot of experience now showing that a lot of other attributes are also important in when you're selecting. So if you look at in Canada, for example, some of the reviews we done earlier in 2016, 17, this experience is generating a much more effective way of choosing and the reasons why you want to choose one technology over another. So as I mentioned, I kind of developed a selection criteria map. Getting back to electricity here, one thing we have to understand is, as I mentioned earlier, wind, solar is variable and intermittent. You're really depending on weather. So therefore, you need flexibility to support that. So if you can look at that on the left-hand side a little bit here, the yellow line is solar and the green line is wind. And basically what this is telling you, these are studies that are made, is that they call it the effective load carrying capability curves. All that means is the more, and at the bottom, you can see it's in gigawatt, or call it megawatts for that matter, the more you slide to the right of that scale, if the reliability of the grid lowers. So if you take solar, for example, you can see the less you're at the high end of the scale, the more facilities you put on the grid reliability goes down. The reason for that is really you can't count on it. And most reliable grids in North America, and I'm sure it's everywhere, always have to have backup to make sure if that power goes away quickly, you need to replace it or you're going to have brownouts. So, you know, we've had the Texas example, was it last winter? California had a couple events. I believe there might even be one in Australia at one point. One of the regions lost their power when the wind died all of a sudden. One thing we note in Canada, the colder it gets, the less wind you have. And really, we need electricity to heat our homes when it's cold. So it's kind of a mismatch. What plays into this, the reason why I brought it up, is this concept of inherent safety that some of these SMRs have, where you know, these reactors will control its own power without any human intervention. It's really interesting. As the heat goes up in the coolant in these reactors, the power actually goes down. So it's not like it is today. So this gives these SMRs a very, very exceptional load following characteristics. So it'll follow these sometimes, to a certain extent, the wind and solar issues. So therefore, they're really a good partner with renewables. And the other thing I was talking about too is the safer they are, obviously a simplified safety case, so therefore they're not as expensive to build. So this comes to the concept of these new grids that are coming forward. In the old days, the levelized cost of electricity, which was the guide, how much electricity was cost, they would do this for every individual asset. And the lowest one always won, which is, you know, normally would have been coal and gas would always be the lowest one. There was, you know, it was hard for other technologies to really compete with that. But what's happening here in Canada, for example, is now we are putting a cost against CO2 emissions. So therefore, that cost is changing how these grids might look. So again, taking into account the fact that wind and solar are not as reliable as a baseload unit, taking into account that emissions now count something against the value, the grid is going to be built of flexible types of energy supplies. Wind, hydro, solar are all going to be a mix, including SMRs. So therefore now they call it adjusted level LCOE. It's really a comparison of the flexibility of each unit and how it adds to the what I would call the advantage of that grid of having it there when you need it. So those in the older days, it really was not calculated that way. It was always the lowest asset, you know, one on the grid. So I think grid operators are now, or electrical grid operators are now rethinking how to move forward with this. It's a bit of a different concept. I call this the elephant and the butterfly because the big reactors can't really follow the wind, which is bubbling up and down, or solar. Big reactors are made to just go to 100% and sit there. That's where they're most efficient. That's where they make their money. SMRs have the other option. And then if you add on this heat storage peaking ability, which is really big molten salt tanks that conserves heat. And then when you need it, you know, you steam them off and you add more energy to the grid. They're really very flexible. Getting back to uranium here, which is interesting. So I kind of brought out the three types of reactors. So the Canadian, they're called CANDU reactors. They use natural uranium. They are just, you know, where the US nuclear power plants and some of the SMRs are enriched about 3 to 5%. And that's the limit today for commercial reactors, is around 5%. There's nothing else. There's no facility that's licensed to make any more of that. But for commercial reactors, you're 3 to 5. Some of the new SMRs are going to run between 5 and 19.9%. So what's important about the 19.9% is the international rules and guidelines says that commercial power generation, it's called HALEU, the maximum is going to be 19.9. That's the most they will let any country use for commercial generation. So if you look, I heard like Australia is looking at naval, if they're nuclear, and most research reactors, they're around 90 and above, 90%. They're quite enriched. The Opal reactor in Australia, is my understanding, I'm just reading it, it's somewhere between 3 to 5. So it's still in the range of the US market. And right now today, the HALEU, which is again getting to the 5 to 19.9%, there's really no commercial available supply chain for that today. So therefore, that would be a new market or something new that the uranium industry would have to look at in the manufacturing side. Now, I'm not an expert in uranium nor into making fuel, but my understanding is that there's actually more money to be made in making fuel than the biggest part of the market where the most profit is made is on the fuel manufacturing side, which I'm not sure. Maybe somebody else knows that better than I do. But certainly, uranium has a lot more. Uranium is a small pellet is as much as 400 kilograms of coal. So it's really. On the right bottom there, I just showed the front end and the back end fuel cycle and, mining to milling to conversion to enrichment, fuel fabrication. And then it's that back end piece that's still in debate in Canada, among other places. Right now, it goes from interim storage to final disposition. There is some companies now that are looking to reprocess the fuel. However, in North America, for commercial, it's not been approved. It's something that would have to, do a lot of work to get that particular cycle in place. And the reason why I say that is reprocessing from North American side has always been linked to the nuclear bomb. And so therefore there could never be the public opinion to try to do this. Although it's, you can decrease the amount of waste you have significantly. It's just never been sold to anybody. So an approach to technology development on something like this was really interesting. And I think I just want to bring you through the Canadian, how we got. So, we have nuclear reactors. They're going to get refurbed. They're going to get another 30 years. But truly, that was not a future for nuclear industry in Canada. It seemed like it was only going to be a bridging strategy because there was nothing being built. To build big reactors today, it's an enormous sums of money. We have examples in the US where it's just not gone very well. I would say maybe 5, 7, 10 years ago in Canada, they were estimating building a big one. And it was just outside its price. There's just no way that they're going to pay that much money for nuclear reactors. So therefore, most of the provinces said, we still think there's a role for it. So this is how the SMRs really came to be in Canada or being driven. And really, it was truly a pan-Canadian thing. So, if a country or whatever wants to go down this road, it needs not only federals and provincials and state governments, it needs industry, it needs the nuclear industry itself, it needs the supply chain. And that's what this roadmap, we called it, really came to be. It was a tremendous effort across Canada. There was meetings held east to west and with, provinces, territories, power utilities, vendors, supply chain from across the country gathered. They engage with stakeholders. They explain what these processes can do, what these SMRs can do. And really, there's if you go into this PanCanadian Roadmap, there's about 100 chapters, and there's probably, so if there's over 100 chapters, over 100 groups or peoples or associations that played in this. And there was about 500 actions placed against different companies and whoever. Which really showed Canadians and showed the federal government that it's worth doing something here because of the belief that nuclear does play a role in net zero emissions. But going forward, it had, and even in the public engagement and really focused on the First Nations. And I can tell you there's examples, real success stories with the First Nations here in Canada. There's one here in New Brunswick called Papineau First Nations. I mean, they are prime backers. They see the economic benefit for their people in the region. There's another one in Saskatchewan called First Nations Power Authority, which is kind of a grouping of a number of them that are working. And they participated and were one of the enablers in this particular roadmap, which was so key to getting to where we were going. It took, in one piece, it took care of, or shouldn't say took care of, but considered was this just transition for the workforce, meaning that any energy source that it would replace, the approach would be is, as I mentioned, those jobs transferred into this new industry. It had to be that way to get the engagement. There was federal support, and in Canada, federally, they've supported one sort of technology more than the others. They've supported the molten salt technology. We have actually one of the vendors, one of the designers is called Terrestrial. They're a Canadian company. And they've had support, and we've had another company because of the reprocessing angle. They're a company out of UK that moved into Canada and New Brunswick called Moltex, and they're molten salt also. Another key component of this was obviously harmonizing the licensing regimes, because out of the 10 or 12 SMR vendors that are actually playing in the field, most of them are from the US. So you have to have that harmonized between the licensing. And obviously, in developing the supply chain, because these are new things that you're building. So the old supply chain has to change, or you have to have new suppliers in some of these parts and pieces. Getting to the mining sector, I thought maybe we just focus on that for a sec. And Julian, I'm looking to you. I'm hoping I'm not running over time here, but the mining sector, they did a study that this PanCanadian Roadmap, they had a group get together, and they modeled a 20 megawatt reactor for a mid-sized mine with a capital cost of capital somewhere between 6 to 9% discount rate. And they estimated a 20 to 60% cost advantage over diesel to run their heat processes and their electrical processes. And what they, as I mentioned, size and temperature plays a role in here, but these were like transportable SMRs. These things have 10-year fuel cycles. So therefore you only fuel them once in 10 years. There's, potential to co-generate heat and power. And there's, further economic improvements relative to diesel competitive. And they also looked at off-peak, can you produce hydrogen to run the vehicles, which was one of the, obviously. And as one of the CEOs of the Mining Innovation Rehabilitation and Applied Research Corp in Canada here, he said this is really a huge change for the mining industry, in the North in particular, to really look at something like this. For their energy use. Just in closing here, in Canada, the nuclear industry, they used really a streaming profile or a streaming approach, 3 lanes. The Ontario group, they had Stream 1, which are really on grid, so they're bigger, they're 300 megawatts. And there was an announcement that General Electric Hitachi's boiling water reactor SMR, which is water-based, would be moving forward to at least to more engineering. And they're looking at a late 2020 deployment. And right now it's in the licensing process, so it's on its way. Stream 2, which is really the New Brunswick, which is the advanced Gen 4s. Remember the higher temperatures, these are liquid sodium and molten salt. It's in its vendor design reviews, and they're, predicting somewhere early to mid 2030s. I would tend to think it's more towards the mid 2030s now. There's been some delays. And then the bottom one, again, Stream 3 is the Ontario one. And this is the one that is the mining one. The remote and resources is called the micro, which I was just talking about earlier. And it's in the license process started too. And in fact, they think this thing will be ready in 2026. So a lot of work's been done in Canada. It's been quite a team effort. And, with that, Norm has gone through his little spiel here and certainly open to questions. But, it takes an effort and it takes an effort by many, not just by one, to go through this. And I was lucky enough, I was telling Julian my story when I was doing my consulting thing, and they come to ask me to start up one of the companies. I tell the story that I had a key, an empty office, and didn't even have a chair to sit on. That's where I started from, and now there are like 50 people, 50 engineers in there, moving forward. So with that, I turn it back over to you, Julian. Thank you.
Yeah, great, Norm. We have got a real stream of questions coming in here, and they're really diverse and interesting. And the first one, I've got them on two different streams. I'll try and hit them all. This is from Sophie York, who politely addresses you as Mr. Sawyer and thanks you. And she said that a legislative ban was introduced in Australia via the Green Party amendment, which is interesting. And she gives the date of December 1999, which is quite interesting. So we've been off the map since December 1999 in considering nuclear energy. Much has changed since on the number of fronts, including knowledge, technology, and voter expectations. Do you have any plans to speak to Australian members of Parliament about this important topic? Kind regards and thank you. Well, Norm, what are your plans about talking to our politicians? Come on, man.
Well, I tell you, I spent a lot of time with politicians in Canada. I don't know any politicians, but if they ever invite me to go speak to them, I would go talk to them.
Sophie. We'll just Sophie will get the red carpet out, and we've got some politicians who seriously need to meet you. And thank you, Sophie. There's in no particular order. There's one here from John Welborn, who probably played football against Canada at some stage. He says, our Prime Minister, in announcing the AUKUS security agreement last September and its focus on nuclear submarines, appeared to distance this decision from any potential for a civilian, you can do it, nuclear power industry in Australia. You've mentioned jobs and emissions as the main political driver of changing legislation. Is there an obvious connection for future Australia between maintaining a nuclear submarine fleet and the development of a civilian nuclear capability? Is a sub powered by an SMR or an MMR? So that's yes. You can see fishing in a similar pool here.
Yeah, and the answer is yes. SMRs came from submarines, basically from years ago, and they're water-based. Obviously, they're not liquid-based. And I would tell you there is a direct link between a naval program and in a commercial power generation in most countries. I mean, the U.S. Look at I think Brazil is in that boat too. So there is a direct link, and because you gain so much experience in the naval program that you then end up using it at in the civil power generation. So I would think that there must be a road there somewhere to go from that to civil.
Okay, well, that's a great answer. Nice to hear from you, John. And I think also with a submarine, you could take a politician for a ride in a submarine and find out if they were as stupid deep down as they appear to be on the surface. That's another way. Sorry, that's an old joke. I just couldn't resist it. Here's another one from, we've got one coming in from, Christopher Skinner. You mentioned that Australia has recently committed to acquire nuclear submarines. Question is, there we go, same question. How similar is it? Well, there you go, Christopher. SMRs came from nuclear submarines. Norm, I was also just hoping you might comment on my own little note here, which is that the high level waste of a lifetime of a human being, is that around about a kilo? Did I hear that?
Yes. So there's a study out of France. So remember I said France was like, I forget the number, 77% of their grid is nuclear. The lifetime of a person living in France that's using electricity from a nuclear power plant is the size of your hand. That's the waste. I mean that's quite considerable. I'll talk about my sister. My sister, bless her heart, she says nuclear and stuff, and I said, in Canada, and I think I'm not sure about it. It's different in different places in the U.S. and stuff. In Canada, for every electricity you use in your home and you pay for, there's a very, very small percentage of money taken and put aside to deal with the waste. So since the 1940s or 50s, whatever it started, Canada, we've been paying to put that waste away. And in Canada, it's not a technology issue. It's getting the acceptance of people to, find a site and put it away. So in a way, there's never been anybody hurt by nuclear waste. There's never been anything bad done it. But the nuclear industry has been protecting its waste in the environment since it first started. It's one of the only industries that have really done that to that amount of perfection.
With a perfect record. They're streaming in. This is from Stephen Wilson. Who or what key individuals or organisations were the catalyst or initiator of the PanCanadian SMR Roadmap, and how was the process sustained and funded to maintain its momentum? Now, that's obviously an opportunity for a very long answer, but if you can give me a shorter one, I'll give you a question.
Yeah. So it was industry nuclear operators driven. It was NRCan, National Resources Canada, which is a federal government department. They were an enabler, and monies came from the federal government to support it because there was so much momentum. And they also gave a significant amount of funds to the First Nations to make sure that they understood the processes and what was going to occur. So so therefore, that whole grouping. So, like I say, it was generated by the industry, supported by the federal government, and it continues today. I mean, these actions are being monitored, and there's actually a committee now that's watching over it, a Canadian committee, and it's just generating that interest and that momentum was key to get it going. And I was part of it, and we spoke a lot about it everywhere.
Okay. This is from Robert Bolton. The Australian government has requested universities plan for 300 nuclear engineers for the proposed submarine AUKUS plan. Will this be enough? What is the Canadian experience? How many engineers does it take to change a nuclear submarine?
Well, we don't have nuclear submarines, so nuclear submarines in the US. So we only have commercial. And I think that's probably one of the things that made maybe nuclear easier in Canada is we made it very hard to make the link between our civil nuclear to the naval nuclear, from a wartime thing. So I don't know if that's enough. I've not worked in the submarines, but I think that in the civil side, it would probably take a lot more than that.
Well, great. And these are great questions, I must say. You can feel those tingling interest around this subject here. Here's one from Lou Rosman. Norm, I've been led to believe that South Korea is advanced in developing SMRs. Is this correct, Lou?
Yeah. Yes, it is. They've worked on two types. They work on the gas type, which has actually been approved through their government, and then they have also a sodium type. So they have two types. So China has just started up. People tell me, well, none of these things have ever run. Well, the early designs in the 78, they all had prototypes that ran, and now China just started up, I think last week, their first, and they have a high temperature gas reactor, and they're starting up a pair, which will run one turbine at 250 megawatts, so 125 each. And the first one just started up last week. So China has been moving very quickly, both on the SMR side and on the large builds.
Okay. Here's one from Murray Hutton. Is the uranium the only fuel that SMRs can use? Can thorium be used?
Some reactors are, yes. And for example, and on the, some SMRs can use thorium, and then obviously the CANDU reactor, they actually tested that. The Chinese wanted to do that, and they have a CANDU over there, and they want to use thorium. And that is one of the fuels that people have been thinking of also. But to date, most of the effort has been on uranium, not thorium.
Okay, there was a comment here from Tony Irwin about the opal, and I missed the factor, but it says opal is 19.75%. Does that mean, I'm not sure where that fitted, it was a comment.
19.75?
Yeah, correct.
Oh, is that right? Okay, I was on their website. It said it was the same thing as, okay, well, I didn't know that. Okay, thank you for that correction.
See, wow, we got what informed listeners we got here. You know?
There you go, yes.
We know how to mine it, we don't know, you know. Yeah, okay. Here's one from Ian Bain. Thanks, Norm, for your presentation. We hear capital costs are too high. Can you give us an indication of the capital costs of SMR plants? And I guess this comes down to, you know, they're essentially manufactured in a factory, and so it's going to become a production line question. Is that correct, Norm?
That's correct. So, and obviously the first of a kind will be a little bit higher than what comes after. And obviously you need a market to sell them. But they are quite considerably less cost. The problem is you're going from I call it a stick file. That's the ones we built years ago, that you go in a field and you build them. And therefore, when somebody's welding, it's snowing and raining around them and they're welding. And so you get away from that. You build all your components in a manufacturer where you can test them, and you do most of the work in the shop, and then you ship them with trucks. Right, piece by piece, right? So you gain significantly on the timelines. You shorten your time constructions, and so therefore, by shortening time and constructions, you pay less interest overall. So the capital cost goes down significantly.
So, but we don't. I guess we're still, you know, and correct me if I'm wrong, but because we're in a nascent stage with SMRs per kilowatt of capability, do we know whether they're going to be cheaper, or we think generally they are? Capital costs are generally down, right?
Yeah, that's correct. And they're running about, some are saying it could be like 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Some are saying 7. So there's kind of a range right there. And as these design moves forward more and more, obviously we'll understand more. And people ask me, well, which one is the right number? Well, you have to get through a lot of stuff. So right now, I would tell you that probably NuScale is gone through his whole design, has gotten his design approved in the US. They're in about $1 billion right now. And a lot of it came from the government.
And a lot of that.
So they probably,
a lot of that's, research work and development work. So it's hard to say, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the next ones won't cost as much. So I'm just saying that, over time, that number will go down. It's much like building ships. You build the first one, it's quite, and then the price goes down as you build a second, third, fourth.
Yeah. So, there's the potential's there for that declining cost. So that's important. There was somebody pointed out that the state that lost power in Australia was South Australia, and it also produces more uranium than any other state in Australia. So,
okay.
the home of the Olympic Dam mine. Tony Irwin, what is your opinion of boreholes for spent CANDU fuel final disposal?
That's not what they're going to do. The borehole concept was used in some of the research reactors, not only here, around the world. But the big, I mean, depends how you call a borehole. I call a borehole a small one. But the big dig they want to do, there's a lot of debate going on in Ontario currently. Like 98% of our used fuel is in Ontario because all the reactors are there. There's a little bit here in New Brunswick. You know, as I mentioned, I think it's not a technology discussion, it's a social discussion, and that becomes very difficult. And in Canada, you know, we have a law here that calls duty to consult, especially with the First Nations. So therefore, a lot of effort is placed and make people understand, you know, the efforts and how safe it is. And the concept of safety varies in individual. It's a personal thing. So therefore, you know, some people say nuclear waste is not safe. You make it safe. Although it's been sitting, you know, in above ground silos since 1970s, maybe 80s here in Canada, and it's been safe. It's just been there, and so therefore, I think they found the solution. Whether they'll be able to do it is another question. Yucca Mountain in the U.S. is the other one that's been debated for I don't know how long. And in fact, in the U.S., people don't know this, the federal government pays the operator to hold on to the fuel because the law was written that it would be ready by a certain date in the 70s or 80s, and it's never been there. So since then, the federal government's been giving money to the operators to take care of the used fuel.
Huh. Okay, well, here's another fact from one of our listeners, Norm. Canada decided to acquire nuclear submarines in 1987, but then cancelled the program due to the stated high cost and possibly encouragement from the USA, which I mean, I think that means possibly encouragement to cancel. But look, so there you are. There's a fact. Somebody's fact checking for us in the background. Australia, you mentioned Wyoming. We are a coal-driven nation. Our exports, coal prices have never been as good as they are today. Well, they have been, but we're at certainly at decade highs at the moment. And your point that you know Australia is vulnerable is a really good reason why our state and federal governments should be looking at this nuclear option. Norm, your expertise, we don't have anything quite like it in Australia. Well, I can't say that, but generally speaking, there might be somebody who was there. Hang on, I've got another one. How do you, oh, here we go. Look, we've got a couple of late runners. I better fit these in for short answers, please, Norm. Our CSIRO, and this is from Rob Yates, in recent reports estimated the LCOE of SMR electricity generated at $150 to $300 per megawatt hour compared to wind and solar at 30 and 50. Based on the Canadian cost, do these costs look reasonable? Can you comment on the wide difference?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the nuclear sub-program. I'm not a Canadian historian, obviously. So, yeah, that cost seems high. The thing about wind and solar people don't understand, and in fact, one of the utility companies here just made a pretty drastic move, which upset a lot of people. These things don't run unless you have the other generation available to support it. So I always tell when people tell me cost of wind is low, yeah, it's low by itself, but you need something else. So you got to add on that cost. So therefore there was a study here in Ontario that said, well, if you have wind, solar, you reduce the energy consumption per person. So in other words, you got to do your own thing. You then have batteries, and then you have within your house, you have these smart meters that don't use electricity at night, blah, 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 and you have heat storage. It's lower than an SMR. Well, okay. Well, if you take an SMR and add all those things, you get the same thing. So the comparison, some things, they're not being compared one for one. But at the end of the day, you can't run a grid with solar only unless you're extremely lucky, especially if you have a lot of heavy industry involved on that grid. So therefore, when it needs energy, it needs energy. And when you don't have the power for them, these companies are not making money. So, you know, it's that comparison that's very difficult. I continue to believe that there's a place for wind and solar, but it needs the backup. So either you do that with hydro, you can do some batteries, but I think you need nuclear as a base load. You know, I was at earlier on there. I don't know if you know my second slide. I was at the I was asked to present at the U.S.-Japan economic table, and I remember the Secretary of Energy showing up, and he made his speech. I was talking to him after him, and he said, "There's not enough batteries in the world to back up wind in the U.S. For more than 2 minutes." So think about that. If you're going to put all this wind in the U.S. and try to back them up with batteries and solar, the grid would only run for 2 minutes. It's incredible when you think about it. So it's where do you draw that line? And I think, you know, as I mentioned, the grids of the future, but one of my slides talked about this, adjusted LCOE, you have to start looking at giving credit for the asset's flexibility and being there when it's required. That's worth something, and it's not being credited right now. That's my view.
Okay, Norm, just one more, if I may. The security question, Andrew Forrest here in Australia rates the security issue as too high to even consider that he's promoting wind and solar. To consider nuclear as a possibility. Please, a quick comment on that. And there is actually one here on enriching how much more yellowcake is required to produce 20% enriched uranium. So that's a bit of a technical one, might be a bit off the beat for now. Could I just finish maybe on that one, please, Norm? Security, and then we'll wrap it up. We're over time. We've had a really good retention here, and I just want to, I'll wrap it up right after that comment about do SMRs create additional security risks?
Actually, they're less risk than the big ones because most of these the new designs are actually built in the ground. They're not built up, they're built down. And so therefore, in the old version, after 9/11, there was a lot of work done in security, a lot of backfit security, where in the new design, security is being designed into the new design. So therefore, you know, these reactors, from a security perspective, are the aspirational goal is to have it that you need less people there with guns to protect.
Okay, all right. Well, that answers the actual question was about theft and bad actors. So I guess that's the point too. You need there's a smaller target to defend, and it's underground. So listen, yeah. Thanks. I better wrap it up there. Norm, your expertise is piped from the other side of the globe all the way to down under here, and we really appreciate you taking the time and enthusiasm. You've obviously, you know, there's lots of people here who'd like to welcome you to come and have a go at our politicians. We certainly have but everybody who's been listening here is now informed to a higher level. Each of those people can go on and have a conversation of their own and propagate what they've learned here today. These are the way that waves spread and propagate. And so all of your experience has landed on fertile ground, and we've had some really fantastic questions. And I just want to say thank you on behalf of all the members for taking the time out. And I know you're going to go out and dig some snow now and try and plough your way back home again. But it's been lovely having you, and I'll be talking to you some more very soon. And just want to say thanks on behalf of the members for a great presentation, and best wishes.
Well, I appreciate it.